Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. Today we are looking at a case from 2004 that led to 2 deaths, a life sentence, and is still the subject of much debate as to the validity of the evidence presented in court. On Monday, the 9th of February 2004, 24-year-old Benjamin Geen was arrested on his way to work. He was a nurse in the Accident and Emergency Department at Horton General Hospital in Banbury, Oxfordshire. At the time of his arrest, he had a syringe containing liquid in his fleece pocket. He discharged the syringe into his pocket and would not tell the police what the liquid was. Analysis of his fleece would later establish that the syringe contained vecuronium, which is a muscle relaxant which, when administered incorrectly, could cause respiratory arrest. This would be seen by prosecutors as the smoking gun in their case against Benjamin. He was charged with 2 counts of murder and 16 cases of grievous bodily harm. Benjamin denied all of the charges. 3 days earlier, on Friday the 6th of February, the police were brought in at the request of the medical management team to independently investigate 18 cases of unexplained respiratory arrest that had occurred in the A&E department in the preceding 9 weeks. Respiratory arrest is basically the absence of breathing. Depending on the health of the patient, this may be expected, but in the 18 cases under investigation, the patient's symptoms at the time would not indicate that they were at risk of respiratory arrest. The number of cases that Horton General Hospital had seen during this 9-week period was seen as abnormally high. The 18 people who were investigated during this time had little in common. They ranged in age from 22 to 89 and had been taken to the emergency department with a variety of different illnesses with differing levels of severity. The first of these was 53-year-old David Long, who had been taken to the hospital due to a lithium overdose. During David's treatment, Benjamin inserted a tube into his arm to allow drugs to be administered. A doctor checked on David and found him alert and responsive with a clear chest and steady pulse, yet shortly after the doctor left the room, David stopped breathing. He was successfully revived. 5 days later, 77-year-old David Nelson was admitted with a chest infection. Whilst being treated by Benjamin, his condition deteriorated. David was taken to the resuscitation room when he stopped breathing. Thankfully, he too was successfully revived. Former police officer 51-year-old Robert Robinson, 89-year-old Hilda Wigram, Walter Coates, who was 61, and 73-year-old Sheila Gray Snook all had similar experiences. The same happened to 73-year-old John Thorburn, who was revived after going into respiratory arrest but never returned to full health after his ordeal. 66-year-old Anthony Bateman arrived at the hospital feeling unwell due to a range of serious health problems, severe lung disease and cancer. Nevertheless, he was sitting up in bed chatting, eating breakfast and drinking a cup of tea when he was seen by Dr. Sally Hughes. The doctor instructed Benjamin to set up a saline drip, ordered an X-ray and left. Less than half an hour later, Anthony was dead. After he stopped breathing, the doctors tried to resuscitate him, but, believing that his various illnesses were causing the respiratory arrest, decided that he should not be kept artificially alive. Further unusual occurrences of respiratory arrest followed. 22-year-old Jonathan Feltham, Harold Boss, who was 66, 55-year-old Noreen Brooks, 79-year-old Arthur Marlowe, Grace Fox, who was 88, and 70-year-old Esther Jordan all suffered similar patterns where they stopped breathing and then they were revived. 75-year-old David Onley, who suffered from a serious heart condition, stopped breathing shortly after Benjamin arrived on duty one day. He was revived but went on to have a heart attack that he could not survive. 67-year-old Herline Probert was admitted to the hospital with a dislocated shoulder. Herline was a retired nurse who worked on the very ward where she was admitted. She was in a great deal of pain and given intravenous morphine for her shoulder injury, but was otherwise in good health. She remembers Benjamin arriving to flush out her drip, and seconds later she was unconscious. She too was revived after going into respiratory arrest. The defence would later state that it was their belief that she had reacted badly to the morphine, a side effect of which is respiratory depression. When 42-year-old Timothy Stubbs was admitted with stomach pains but suffered a sudden collapse in a totally unexpected way, ending up on a life support machine before making a rapid recovery, it was clear that something was amiss and an investigation was started. The only common denominator in every case, Benjamin. He was present every time. When the case went to trial, the prosecution case relied heavily on the fact that the cases of respiratory arrest were unexpected and unexplained. The people who were involved did not have illnesses where respiratory arrest would be reasonably anticipated. The prosecution would state that sudden and unexplained respiratory arrest is normally a very rare event indeed. Years can go by without one occurring, yet here they were in double figures within a few months. People started to ask questions. The court heard that the spate of respiratory arrests in the A&E department at that time was so exceptional that it could only be explained by there being a maniac on the loose. Additional evidence was also presented that many of the victims had been found to have either midazolam or vecuronium present in their system. Vecuronium is the muscle relaxant which was found in the syringe that Benjamin had at the time of his arrest. Midazolam is a drug used before medical procedures to cause sleepiness and relieve anxiety. Administered incorrectly, it too can cause respiratory arrest. The prosecution detailed how Benjamin had a gung-ho attitude and had previously been reprimanded for wearing nurses' epaulets before he was qualified to do so, and for attempting to plaster cast a patient's broken wrist when he was not trained in the procedure. Testimony was presented about how Benjamin boasted to one doctor that there is always a resuscitation when I'm on duty, and that he was always present when someone became ill for inexplicable reasons. He always seemed to know why and what to do to remedy the situation, sometimes even before the doctors present had given a diagnosis. Benjamin would always drift towards the major cases, even when he was rotated to work in the minor injuries unit and he had been warned by his managers to remain in the area to which he had been allocated. People began having concerns about his behaviour, even to the point that a few had nicknamed him Benjamin Allett after Beverly Allett, the so-called Angel of Death, a serial killer nurse who was convicted of murdering 4 babies, attempting to murder a further 3 and causing grievous bodily harm to 6 others. However, others firmly believed in Benjamin's innocence. The defence described how Benjamin had qualified as a nurse in April 2003, less than a year before his arrest. He had previously been in the Territorial Army, where he was trained as a combat medical technician. He was intelligent, likeable, and always wanted to help. They claimed he was the sort of person who would run towards problems, not away from them. He wanted to be involved and wanted to be good at his job. Benjamin lived in hospital accommodation with his fiancée and as such was readily available to work lots of overtime. He would pick up every available shift and so would often work far more hours than his peers. The defence argued that this would make the odds of him being present during such cases far higher. The defence would continue to describe someone who was proactive in their job and presented plausible explanations to support the claim that he did nothing wrong. It was simply a series of understandable tragic events. The defence argued that the investigation had been flawed from the start, as it had been focused on Benjamin, and patients where he had not been involved were not included in the inquiry. They went on to state that there was no direct evidence to support the claim that he had administered non-prescribed medicines or excess doses, nor had the prosecution provided direct evidence that he had caused the death or intentional harm to patients, adding that the respiratory arrests were a naturally occurring incident and that no crime had been committed. They said that the prosecutions were trying to make a murderer. The syringe and liquid found in Benjamin's fleece at the time of his arrest could be easily explained, the defence claimed. Accident and emergency nurses would often throw on a fleece when going outside to deal with ambulances, and it was not unusual for bits and pieces to end up in their pockets. The syringe needed to be disposed of in a sharps box, which was why Benjamin was returning it to the hospital on the day of his arrest. He panicked and emptied the syringe into his pocket when he saw the police. So, was Benjamin a saviour or an abuser? Were these events purely coincidence? Or did Benjamin have a compulsion to create a situation where he could save the day? After a 2-month trial at Oxford Crown Court, the jury sided with the prosecution, and Benjamin was found guilty of 2 counts of murder and 15 counts of grievous bodily harm. He was cleared on 1 case of grievous bodily harm. Benjamin showed no emotion as the verdict was read. His mother, Erica, burst into tears and had to be comforted by his father, Michael, and also fiancée, Megan Crabb. Benjamin received 17 life sentences that were subject to a minimum term of 30 years. Detective Superintendent Andy Taylor said that the precise motive for his crime may never be known, but that Benjamin was almost narcissistic in his desperate desire to be noticed. However, his defence team believed that he was a victim of panic in the health service at that time. Benjamin was sentenced shortly after the report into the conduct of Harold Shipman was published. Harold Shipman was a doctor who murdered at least 200 of his patients. Since the trial, there have been various appeals, and Benjamin continues to protest his innocence. In 2009, he lost his argument in the Court of Appeal. Then in 2013 and also 2015, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which investigates potential miscarriages of justice and has the power to refer matters back to the appeal court, declined to refer the case. The prosecution's case was largely based on the unusual number of respiratory arrest cases at the hospital. However, this assumption has been questioned extensively since Benjamin's trial. It was reported in July 2023 that fresh evidence has emerged which could undermine Benjamin's conviction. An analysis of a large data set of patients in the United States of America of a similar profile to those involved in the case has suggested that there was nothing unusual about the number of incidents of respiratory arrest on his ward in the winter of 2003 to 2004. It said that 17 cases of respiratory arrest would not only not be unusual, it would be within the range of expected outcomes for such a high-risk population. There do not appear to have been any news updates since this report a few months ago, so only time will tell if this new analysis will lead to any changes in either Benjamin's conviction or his sentence. I would love to hear your thoughts on this case in the comments section below. That concludes today's case. Please click like, and if you're new to the channel, please subscribe. So the petty crime poll showed you petty crimers were missing this section. So time to restart it again with the posh boy and master of ceremonies, Milamba from Australia, lovingly owned by a regular viewer, Lady Melmo. Milamba will do anything for cheese. Next up, we have Mr. Q. Cecilia, who officially is the owner, but in reality is actually Mr. Q's butler. Mr. Q is officially a heat hogger and blocks the heat register or vents in order to keep very warm. And finally today, we have a Londoner called Bino, who last appeared in July 2020 in the Leslie Wilfrid case. Thanks to Joanne Salisbury for sending him in, as he is now in his 14th year. He's stopped squirrel and parakeet chasing as much as he used to and prefers being chauffeured around nowadays. Thank you for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. If you want your pet to be featured, send in videos or pictures, please, to thecrimereel@gmail.com. And remember to give me some details and a little bit of story, locations, be much appreciated. Thanks and goodbye.